Italian anarchist Alfredo Cospito is on his 105th day of hunger strike against the 41 bis prison regime under which he is incarcerated. A prison regime which authorises the violation of human rights, no phone calls, no parcels, no mixing with other prisoners, 22-hour lockup, one visit a month. A prison regime condemned by the European Court of Human Rights for breaching 2 of its articles. Yet this regime continues to exist in an EU member state unchallenged in our so-called democracies. Alfredo has lost over 40 kilos. His potassium levels have dropped. He will die unless action is taken. The Minister for Justice, who must rule on the revocation by February 12th, has said he's going to leave the decision to the judiciary until the 7th of March. This is a death sentence. Alfredo doesn't have that time left. So the question is, will the EU remain silent? This is a human rights issue. Over 200 jurists and lawyers have condemned his treatment. 41 bis must be revoked. Save Alfredo Cospito. Thank you. Thanks, President. I find it a bit hard to take some of the hand-wringing in here about the terrible plight of women and girls in Afghanistan, when outside of these doors hundreds of young Afghans are on the streets of Brussels without a bed, without enough food, and we say nothing. When the claims of Hazara genocide are met with silence and our borders locked to them. When 6 times as many Afghan households are fleeing the impact of drought than they were 2 years ago. 3.2 million children acutely malnourished, 2/3 of the population dependent on humanitarian aid, 4 million more than last year. And hardly 10 people out of 700 could bother to come in here and even talk about it. Well, I'm glad to see the leaked documents from November, when the Commission has finally woken up to the fact that humanitarian aid is not enough, no matter who distributes it. But even the Conservative Human Rights Watch has acknowledged that the shortfalls in food, education and health will not be met without a plan that involves the Taliban. We might hate it, but it's the reality. Otherwise, we're condemning millions of Afghans to poverty, misery, death and destruction. The Afghan people don't deserve to be punished as retribution for the West losing its unjust war. We have to lift the sanctions. We have to unfreeze the financial flows. We have to let the Afghans survive and live. Shutting our mouths and closing our eyes is not good enough any longer. If you read down the EU's anti-money laundering blacklist, one of the things that immediately strikes you is that not one of the countries on the list is majority white, and not one of them is what we would call the West, because this blacklist is biased and inconsistent and has a lot more to do about lobbying power than a genuine assessment of risk. Now, Vanuatu, one of the world's poorest countries, is on the list. Yet the EU says that the criteria for inclusion is about the economic relevance of the third country jurisdiction for the EU and the systemic impact on the integrity of our financial systems. Seriously? Vanuatu, with a GDP of 9% of Greece's, is a threat to our financial integrity? Is it not really the fact that we're picking countries that can't kick us back? Nothing being said about the Netherlands, nothing about Ireland, nothing about the US, nothing about the UAE, which is currently leaning on the EU to keep it off the blacklist, and they'll probably succeed because we want their oil, just as the Qataris would have succeeded if they'd only just stuck to bribing us with oil.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Wallace.
Thank you very much, President. The countries on this list are all non-white, Global South countries. It's uncannily similar to the EU's tax haven blacklist. The rules are applied unilaterally and often imposed on acutely vulnerable former European colonies. For centuries, European economies were built and sustained on the backs of the very colonies which are now desperate to survive and compete in whatever limited way they can. Yet the EU is destroying the ability of these weaker states to compete by weaponising its unilaterally, disproportionately and unfairly applied rules on tax and anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism list. How can we accept the methodology for this list when the US is not on the list? The US financed Al-Qaeda in Syria. The US financed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The US gives almost $4 billion every year to the settler colonial apartheid state of Israel, who carries out state terrorism against the people of Palestine. Why aren't they on the list?
Thanks, President. Europe's population is ageing. Over the next 30 years, our active workforce will decrease by 50 million. Without migration, we face enormous problems to keep our societies going. Yet we have the senseless spectacle of governments all over Europe freaking out about the pensions time bomb, while at the same time standing over migration and asylum policies designed to violently keep out the very young people who could defuse that bomb. Our already overwhelmed health services will sink altogether without the migration needed to redress the balance between young and old. Our political attitudes to migration, frankly, are a form of collective lunacy. At the end of 2021, the share of refugees in the EU was 0.6% compared to its total population. 0.6%. It's embarrassing that we spend so much time on this tiny number of people. This is not a hard problem to deal with. It's actually not a problem at all. It's an opportunity. We need safe and legal pathways for people who want to come here. Stop pushing them back. Stop sending them back. Stop beating them at the borders. Stop allowing the opportunists on the right to set the terms of this debate. Let people in, let them access good jobs, and let them guarantee in that a future for Europe. Thanks, President. I voted against the resolution because, for all the shrill jingoism and belligerent moral outrage about Ukraine winning and Russia being defeated, the truth is nobody wins in war except the military-industrial complex feasting off the billions of taxpayers' money, or the vultures like Blackstone swooping in to feed off the carcass of the devastation and destruction of Ukraine and benefit from the rebuilding against the backdrop of privatisation, deregulation and decimation of workers' rights. Thousands of civilians dead, tens of thousands of soldiers, 15 million people displaced. This is horror, and our response is to send in just enough weapons to make sure it doesn't end. It's barbarous. The motion talks about peace, which is good, when we refuse to support Ukraine when they reached an agreement with Russia last April, forcing them to fight on. But it has to be a just and sustainable peace. No serious person thinks Ukraine can win an absolute victory. So a plan that talks about NATO membership, Ukraine be the European equivalent of Israel on steroids, retaking Crimea, has to stop if we want Ukraine to survive. Since September, the lack of interest in finding answers to who was behind the Nord Stream gas explosion has been frankly astounding. This was an act of sabotage, an act of unrivalled vandalism, economically and environmentally, and not a word, no discussion, no questions. Then along comes Seymour Hersh, the world's most acclaimed, distinguished living investigative journalist. He produces a detailed claim that the United States executed this explosion with the help of Norway. Planned months before the invasion, a Norwegian Navy P-8 surveillance plane dropped a sonar buoy on the 26th of September, which triggered explosions planted by US Navy Panama City divers 3 months earlier under a NATO exercise, and still nothing. I don't know what happened, but I want to know. This is a man who doesn't make claims lightly, a man with contacts, and I find it frankly jaw-dropping that the EU is not asking questions as to who is responsible for sabotaging the livelihoods of our citizens. I am ashamed to be a European. Grazie, Presidente. These two files are obviously part of the Commission's priority for a new push for European democracy. And I mean, ensuring a right to vote and stand for election throughout the EU is grand, but it's hardly the biggest problem with European democracy. In fact, it's a technical fix for what is deep-seated problems of a disconnect between the citizens and the institutions, where in 7 member states less than 30% of people bothered to vote in the last European elections. And the reason for that wasn't because they were mobile. It's just that they couldn't be bothered because they felt that the European Parliament and the EU didn't represent them. And the reason for that at its very heart is the neoliberalism which is enshrined in the policies and the treaties of the EU, which have led to a massive increase in inequality, an undermining of public services, privatisation, a cynicism in terms of national governments, national health and so on. And unless we go back to basics and bottom-up democracy, we're kidding ourselves that these type of fixes are going to make any difference whatsoever.
Grazie.
The horror of tens of thousands dead, the freezing conditions, the cries unanswered because the equipment wasn't there to get them out of the rubble. And bad and all as that is, we know that the deaths that have already occurred are going to be met by many, many more. So rather than clapping ourselves on the back about how great we've been to respond, we should acknowledge that our response is far from adequate, and it pales into insignificance with the amounts that we are sending in to keep the conflict in Ukraine going. And bad enough as our response is to Turkey, our response to Syria has been utterly disastrous. A country abandoned even before the earthquake hit. The UN Syria humanitarian programme last year was only 47% funded. We've left the people of that country die without medical provisions, without food, because of illegal sanctions which are killing people. And the earthquake has finally made people take notice. Aid agencies are screaming for these sanctions to be lifted. UN special rapporteurs have said humanitarian efforts are hampered by sanctions. We've got to lift the sanctions now, or thousands more will die. Thanks, President. The situation in the DRC is horror without end for the civilian population. In November we talked about displacement and violence, but now, if anything, the situation is even worse. We know that the UN have reported the active engagement of Rwandan armed forces on Congolese territory and M23's zone of influence expanding. And vicious and all as the violence is being perpetrated in that area, the truth is that the only way and the only solution is diplomatic dialogue. But it would seem that many in the international community couldn't care less what happens as long as their own interests are being looked after. What can we expect from President Macron's forthcoming visit in March, when France is the one who's pushed the European Union to grant €20 million in support to the Rwandan military in Mozambique to protect French interests there? What can we expect from London, who organised a summit in Kigali to conclude an agreement to deport asylum seekers back to Rwanda? The truth is the curse of the DRC continues, with rich natural resources being robbed by others. God help them to help themselves, because certainly the EU isn't going to do it.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, Mick Wallace. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, President. 2 weeks ago, Pope Francis, on his first visit to the Democratic Republic of Congo, denounced the internal and external organisations that orchestrate war in the country to plunder its resources. It is, he said, above all, a war unleashed by an insatiable greed for raw materials and money that fuels a weaponised economy and requires instability and corruption. Little has changed since King Leopold looted Congo's resources to enrich himself and Belgium, killing over 10 million Congolese people while he was at it. The year-long conflict between the DRC government and the M23 rebels, which Rwanda's Kagame is reportedly fueling by providing support to the armed group, has caused widespread hunger and displaced more than 2 million. Meanwhile, France and Total Energies are looking to enrich themselves at the expense of the Congolese and looking to clear areas away so that they can make money out of robbing the place of resources as ever. How come there's no one talking about establishing any kind of peace talks? How come no one gives a damn about sorting out the things there? We have a lot of influence there, but we very seldom use it in a positive way.
Thanks, President. 12 years ago, Tunisians overthrew Ben Ali, and many Europeans thought that this was all about democracy and Tunisians wanting to be more like us. But the truth is that, yes, it was a reaction to brutal repression, but also to the wider regime of global inequality, shocking unemployment, food inflation and intolerable living conditions, because the country was being run for foreign interests rather than in the interests of the people who live there. And now, here we go again. Tunisia battered under structural assault, the IMF and World Bank neoliberal reforms gutting the state, food and fuel crises only deepened by the war in Ukraine, and again arrests, imprisonments and real repression against the opposition. But let's not condemn the effects and ignore the causes. Don't pretend that this has nothing got to do with us. There's no justice without social justice, and our assistance always comes with strings attached, and it's these strings which bind societies in debt servitude, a pattern repeated across Africa and across the world. This isn't just Tunisia's repression and chaos, it's ours too. Thank you, President. The idea of an independent EU ethics body is, of course, something to be welcomed, but I have to say we run the very real risk of fiddling while Rome burns if the ethics body focuses only on individual behaviour and doesn't address systemic issues such as the wholesale institutionalisation of lobbying in EU bodies. We have to address in a really serious way the stranglehold of economic and corporate power which has taken its grip on decision-making in here. And that does, of course, mean closing revolving doors for sure. But the problems go much deeper than that, and any ethics body worthy of its name can't shirk from that. Corporate power calls the shots in here. I think we have to be careful as well that any ethics body is scrupulously independent, because if it isn't, we run the risk of creating more problems than we solve. It would be disturbing indeed if the push to do better is weaponised to cast suspicion on people for political reasons. So we have an opportunity to do something worthwhile. Let's not waste it. Thank you, President. 1 year on, as the war in Ukraine continues, when voices everywhere should be calling for a ceasefire and peace, this resolution is driving us in the opposite direction, so I proudly voted against it. It peddles the latest lie that this is not now about defending Ukraine, it's about Ukraine must win. What does that even mean? Last April, there was a deal on the table which would have seen Russia withdraw in return for Ukrainian non-NATO membership, but Ukraine's Western friends, killer clown Boris Johnson and NATO rocked into town and told them to keep fighting. The result? 6 cities devastated, 4 provinces illegally annexed, €108 billion in aid, which the people of Ukraine are going to have to pay back over decades, global food and energy crisis. Is this winning? Ordinary people don't win in wars. They're cannon fodder in the games of others. And ye can shout glory in here all you like, but there's no glory in the grave, and only graves come out of this folly. It's time for people and the silent majority all over Europe to take to the streets this weekend and demand peace and an end to the war.